many of you already know the work of Professor Joubin. It's actually been inspirational for a lot of your work. I know there's a group of people here who do work on adaptation. And we have literary scholars, we have historians, we have people who bridge the two. So your work and your theorizing of multidisciplinarity will be really, really resonate with all of us. But so I could say so much more about our distinguished guest, but all I'm going to do is repost in the chat here Professor Joubin's personal website, and you, in addition to all the reading you've done, there's more reading, and you can access PDFs through this site. And other than saying thank you for being here, the floor is yours.
I am really honored to be part of today's colloquium. So we're going to start with trans studies, and I've identified two problems here. First, racism and sexism, as you know well, draw on each other's ideologies, whether historically or in contemporary time. And this leads to a second problem, which is race making. So race making often enforces representational practices of gender and vice versa. Bernadette mentioned the film Stage Beauty that she got to watch, which I find really rich as well. It's essentially a modern imagination of Restoration era theater with Othello at the center, right? We have Nick Kniston, this adult boy actor who initially plays a white Desdemona, only to transition into blackface Othello, which coincides with their gender transition as well. So that's one of the examples here. And race making and gender practices in these instances, in what I've observed in modern scholarship about, for example, early modern boy actors, but also gender practices on stage and on screen in our own times, there's often this assumption: race making and gender practices are assumed to be predicated among substitutions, as in substituting Kniston for the white body of Desdemona, for instance, substituting an actor in drag or in blackface with the character being depicted. And I find that a huge problem with this kind of binary and linear substitution. Played by Billy Crudup, Ned Kniston's and Restoration era adult boy actor, the so-called last of his kind, according to the tagline of the film. In the first part of the film, he's in a relationship with Duke of Buckingham, and scholarship tend to mischaracterize this as homosexual relationship. From a transgender trans lens, I read it as a romantic relationship, and I believe in that context, Kniston, the character Kniston, would use she pronouns. And this is Kniston as Desdemona, performing in very stylized manner, right, on stage, as you can see, dying beautifully, as they say repeatedly. Women die beautifully. And this is a screenshot backstage, in one of the moments where you see Kniston still in the costume of Desdemona, practicing more of the gestures deemed feminine for Desdemona. And this is one of the scenes where they're actually on stage bed. That is Desdemona's deathbed. The Duke tells Kniston, "I like to see a golden flow as I die in you." This connects, of course, to Renaissance era discourses of death and sexual pleasure. The Duke further explains that when I did spend time with you, I always thought of you as a woman, and in fact, specifically Shakespearean female characters. So perhaps for the Duke, it is really about playmaking rather than love-making. In the end, when Kniston stops inhabiting female roles on and off stage, their relationship no longer worked. This is when it transitions both in gender and in race. It starts playing Othello in blackface, and I would say he's baptized in cisgender masculinity by carrying out the act of killing the white Desdemona on the stage bed repeatedly. There's one scene where it's so due to the verisimilitude, the theater audiences inside the film gasp because everyone think that Othello has killed Desdemona for real, and they are only reassured when the couple stand up to at curtain call to enjoy the applause. So there's much to be said about the association between early modern femininity and dying beautifully, as well as the association of particular types of death and womanhood. These are well-researched areas, but I think the film brings an extra and very interesting layer in terms of 21st century imaginations of Restoration era theater. So I propose a number of solutions to these modern and early modern assumptions about race and gender. First, critical race methods help trans studies address its often unacknowledged whiteness. Critical race theory focuses on social production of hierarchies. So naturally, these methods lend themselves very well to gender studies, but particularly transgender studies. In the other direction, trans studies can amplify critical race theory's support of minority life experiences, because trans studies is basically a set of critical tools to understand atypical bodies. In fact, if I were to expand my study, I would say race, trans, and disability studies, they all should come together in terms of their examination of atypical bodies, as well as marginalized experiences, and so forth. So in the chapter, I was proposing that race and gender are actually social practices rather than identities. And these social practices evolve over time in each other's presence and in interconnected social spaces. So there's no way to talk about race without thinking about gender, and vice versa. So when we bring race and trans studies together, you begin to realize that transness is pervasive in racial and gender practices. So when I say transness, I no longer just refer to gender, but actually the concept of kind of body being a somatic presence in time. It's time bound. This is a lesson that I learned from queer's theory, particularly about queer futurity as well as nostalgia. So I have two particular goals. I wanted to correct early modern studies' tendency to privilege narrative texts by using performance studies methods to highlight embodied significance of transness, as I've just demonstrated with Stage Beauty. And I think we can do this practically with any performance work on stage or on screen. And I use theory of performativity to deconstruct race and gender as identity categories, rather as social practices. Essentially, performativity, building on Searle and Butler, and the speech act theory, is a set of critical tools to capture transformative cultural practices. We will think about the space and time in which something is said or done, right? Utterances will perform particular social tasks. They will have social consequences, such as officiation, apology, sentencing, someone being sworn in as president. All of these are well-known examples. But in performance context, of course, words carry weight performatively through speech act. So race and gender become actions, not just social practices, but they're actions. So they are like transitive verbs, and they are in transitive relation to each other and to temporal and spatial contexts. So One possible further reading is C. Riley Norton's excellent book, Black on Both Sides, which is a racial history of trans identity. And I think someone wrote in a chat here about their interest in applying trans theory to early modern context, and this is an excellent place to go to start, even if it's not an early modern studies book. So to further distinguish between performativity and performance. Performativity, in short, is a linguistic function that permeates all narratives, including performance, right? And so it permeates social life, it permeates performative works, because when words are uttered, when action is taken, they invariably invoke social consequences and other social actions. And that's highly dependent on the space where this takes place and at the time. So even in a film like Stage Beauty, transness is indexed differently, right? Kinnison, for example, early on presents trans femininity. Later on, they evolve. I would think their gender pronouns would also evolve. So body in time is a very important concept. Instead of kind of pinning down, for example, boy actors' genders, I think it has to do with what stage, what phase of their career. So that's an entirely new lens for us to think about this question. Performance, in contrast, so it's connected, but performance is different from performativity. It's essentially an artistic form of intentioned and citational enactments for limited duration. Performativity, of course, there's no limit in duration, even if the meanings, the cultural meanings might evolve, right? But it's an ongoing process. To wrap up this portion, we can think of a number of study questions. So the first one is gender and how it relates to stage violence. Do all female adaptations, all male productions, or even doubled drag, do these practices, whether in modern or early modern context, would they diminish anti-trans violence? These are common strategies, as you may know, that are used to perform so-called difficult plays, such as Taming of the Shrew. An example is in 2013, African-American Shakespeare Company did A Merry Wives of Windsor, and Belinda Sullivan played Falstaff in the scene where Falstaff transforms into the Witch of Brentford. Sullivan involves in what is known as doubled drag. And here, what is being crossed, of course, is typical gender lines. I'll show you some stage photos. I think that's what you don't get from just reading the chapter. And I think that's one of the benefits that we can have today in our dialogue. I'll show you a lot of images. The other study question is, why are cross-gender roles typically received in modern times as pragmatic nonconformity, typically to score personal gains in patriarchal worlds rather than as transgender expressions? And an example, of course, is if you look at interpretations of Twelfth Night, you can have a lot of these examples. And I started thinking a lot about ethics of care. Ethics of care is a group of theory that talks about care and the value of care. In literary studies, we understand that all characters and all readers, all audiences, we all need care in different contexts, and we can give care to each other. So if we proceed from ethics of care, there's a little section in my chapter on this, we can rethink all of these questions, right? I think on some level, people may think it's rather quaint to do character study or do psychological character study, treating them as if they're real humans. But I think literary criticism has the capacity to become a process of care. If we bring care to interpretation, even for unsympathetic characters like Falstaff, and we can begin to think about the unspoken motivations of these characters, it'll become very productive. This is an image of Belinda Sullivan's Falstaff, Devil's Drag, and you have the scene where the witch is being shipped out of Ford's house. We can circle back and talk more about comedy and cross-gender roles. Why, for example, in Twelfth Night, Viola Cesario is typically hailed as female empowerment versus Falstaff's presentation as a witch. It's often presented as butt of the joke. I mentioned, and as we like it, a film during the pandemic, an all-female film adaptation of As You Like It. This is one of the things that I mentioned. I hope seeing the image helps you solidify your understanding from reading my chapter. Here you have Rosalind presenting as Roosevelt, who attempts to cure Orlando of his love sickness in a kitschy and decked out fortune teller studio in Taipei. Applying all this theory, we can begin to rethink to excavate transness in productions that don't label themselves as trans work, that do not employ trans artists. But I think there is a huge benefit here to read beyond race films or trans films, right? The idea here is that we should open it all up and actually begin to see race and gender and transness everywhere in order to level the playing ground, to resist the ghettoization effect, but also to no longer separate trans and non-trans work, because there's transness in everything. So an example is Michelle Terry's crosscast White Hamlet. They didn't change the character name or pronouns at the London Globe in 2018, and she played against Subhan Saraf's Ophelia, also crosscast. And that same year, you have Jack Lasky playing Rosalind in As You Like It, for instance. This is typical of they really wanted to amplify the energy of ensemble acting. Since it's an ensemble, it's a limited number of actors, right? And they just take turns playing all these different roles. So there's this supposed randomness to it. They call it post-gender productions. We can also reread, of course, Mark Rylance' famous all-male original practice performance of Twelfth Night, also at the London Globe. These works haven't actually typically been read through a trans lens. The Michelle Terry's Hamlet, for example, was most typically in criticism being connected to the long history of female Hamlets. Very important topic, but I think what we miss out is that the transness, again, is doubly marginalized when we read these works like that. Granted, these are actors who identify as cisgender, and yet if we begin to even deconstruct cisgender sexism, we have much to gain. And so, for example, well-known quotes from Macbeth. Have you ever thought of how problematic these questions in the opening act are? Banquos and Macbeth, they took turns to pose questions to the weird sisters. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. What are you, for instance? Now, who are you? In Twelfth Night, Cesario tells Duke Orsino, I'm all the daughters of my father's house and all the brothers too. Of course, there's a more surface level interpretation. This is a reference to the idea that he is the only one left of his family, as far as he knows, right? Doesn't know that Sebastian, twin brother, has survived. So all the daughters and all the brothers, but of course, on a deeper level, what exactly is Cesario saying? Being a daughter as well as a brother. In the end, after the gender reveal scene, the Duke calls on Cesario. Very interestingly, the name Viola is never used. And so from a modern perspective, you might say the Duke never misgenders and dead names Cesario. Twelfth Night is rather peculiar because Cesario never changes into maid's garments. Orsino continues to call him boy and Cesario. Weddings were announced, but it's never staged. That's really the signature of modern adaptations. A lot of them do add those celebrative moments, but if you go back to the text, actually ends with a huge sense of open-endedness. Cesario, of course, notably doesn't have any more line after Orsino's declaration of love. So again, there's ambiguity, but above all else, if you pay attention to the very last bullet point, this is a journey to an elsewhere without returning, without any sense of return, and with diminishing return for cisgender sexism. But what is cisgender sexism? Well, it's a kind of literal-mindedness that seeks false clarity, false binaries. This is particularly problematic as we encounter early modern materials that have a different worldview and different kind of setup in terms of its understanding of racial practices and understanding of gender, right? And so when we talk about suspension of disbelief, it's highly problematic. About what? Usually, it's suspension of disbelief regarding gender crossings. Always have to remember under Cesario there's Viola, but is there? I propose that the text of Twelfth Night should in fact identify the character throughout as Cesario, because that is the main character. Viola is nowhere to be seen other than the beach scene. So what we should suspend is cisgender biases. Rather than this suspension of disbelief. I want to wrap up with the latest. This is also on the list of further readings. One of my books called Contemporary Readings in Global Performances of Shakespeare is coming out from Bloomsbury Arden this fall. And there I use a new concept to read adaptations and particularly global performances. And the concept is heterotopia, which literally means other place. This is as you can see, the etymologically, it suggests an other and a different place, a different motif. And yet in Foucault's usage, it is embedded within another space. Right, heterotopia, parallel spaces, or worlds within worlds. And this is particularly applicable to adaptations of performances that we reimagine a dramatic action in new context. Not to mention, you eventually stage it or film it in some other locations. Here's a quote that is very relevant. Foucault uses the mirror as an example of heterotopia. It says, the mirror is a placeless place. In the mirror, I see myself in the unreal space that virtually opens up behind the surface. And the mirror, of course, becomes a sort of gateway, but it's also a placeless place because it points to and contains other places, even if for itself, it is entirely virtual. If you think about the theatrical stage, this is so true because it's an empty stage. It can become Illyria tonight, it'll become Scotland tomorrow night, right? And so the heterotopia has the power to juxtapose in a single real place several places, several emplacements that are in themselves incompatible. The theater, Foucault finally turns to theater, very briefly, but the theater brings onto the rectangle of the stage a whole series of places that are alien to one another. And not on the screen here is Foucault's commentary on cinema as well. The cinematic screen in a darkened room operates also similarly as heterotopia. I'm going to stop here so that we can delve right into our discussion.
Yeah, first off, this was such a pleasure. And I just want to say your essay on teaching Shakespeare in a time of hate is a touchstone for all the Shakespeare classes I've taught over the last couple of years. It's such important work. I just want to clarify something you talked about in your talk, this idea that trans performance or the double sort of blinded performance in some way can reduce or change or problematize the violence of inherently misogynistic text or violent text. I guess I just want you to sort of, can you talk me through that a little bit? Because I'm thinking about like Othello in particular. And I'm wondering, as I'm watching Othello murder Desdemona, does it matter who Othello is embodied? Am I not always seeing the performance of a destructive Black masculinity?
Othello's race is made to perform in a gendered context. Othello's embodiment does matter. And the first thing we note is how this character experiences intersectional oppression. Othello's selfhood is very much dependent on Desdemona's white womanhood. Linda Booth argues that the availability of Desdemona's body is at the core of the play. Her passivity is one of the only erotic fantasies the culture knows how to construct about female subjects. Dimna Callahan reminds us that the female corpses are focal points for ocular inspection by other characters and by audiences in a way that male bodies are not. I would add that performances of Othello often associate fragile white femininity with particular ways of dying. In the film Stage Beauty, the adult boy actor Ned Kynaston initially presents as female on stage and off stage. Kynaston inhabits white womanhood by dying repeatedly and beautifully, as he proudly asserts. This reflects the historical stereotype that most beautiful thing about Desdemona is her murder, rather than her words or her deeds. Indeed, Kynaston says that, quote, women do everything beautifully, especially when they die. Kynaston and his partner also draw on metaphorical connections between orgasm and death, which was common in the early modern period. Later, Ned Kynaston becomes a cisgender man by inhabiting Othello's racialized masculinity and by killing a woman on stage. Kynaston's performance of Black masculinity shows that racialized identities are profoundly constituted by exclusionary gendered narratives. So the answer is no. Transgender performance here does not diminish the gravity of Othello's violence. It enhances the tragic pathos. But seen through the trans lens, Kynaston's blackface Othello is transitive. His embodiment of violent racialized masculinity depends upon the projected vulnerability of white femininity, and vice versa. So race and gender, they constitute each other, and the practice of masculinizing blackface is transformative, at least for the character Kynaston. Interestingly, the final scene of the film teases playfully with fluidity as part of their foreplay in an intimate scene immediately following their performance of Desdemona and Othello. Maria asks this Kynaston, so who are you now? Maria is referring to the masculine and feminine characters Kynaston has played in his career, as well as various guises he has taken on while role-playing with Maria in bed. Kynaston shrugs and says, I don't know. Perhaps the point is that the pursuit of binary identities is a futile exercise because gender practices evolve contextually and over time. When I post this question on the screen here, I meant to ask, in what ways does embodiment matter, right? And how is that connected to or disconnected to stage violence? You asked a good question about Othello. We can excavate all the moments where characters refer to themselves in the third person. And Othello's final scene is very well known for that, right? Othello becomes at least two. There are two parts of himself. And for me, there's very rich. This is a rich moment of performativity to be excavated. And we can apply the theory of performativity here to think about this level of disjoining of different selves within one person. It's also possibly the actor here noting their reluctant enactment of this particularly violent role. And so that kind of distance could help a little bit. We're not apologists, of course, to say that, to try to save Othello. But you mentioned teaching, Jamie. So in teaching, I think this level of meta-theatricality could help put distance to the violence and encourage critical analysis, whether it's race or gender.
I have a lot of questions, so I'll just ask in the gap. And one that you did bring up, and I think it's an ethical question, it's a methodological question about the ethics of care. And particularly, and I noted it when I read, the article in which you elaborate this point. But you did say also in the presentation, yes, I hope I got it, I wrote it down, but you've got it up here as well. All characters and readers need care and give care to each other. Literary criticism is a process of care. I would like to see if we could talk more about that and even expand it out to historiography. What would that mean as well for the practice of engaging? We're early modernists here, but we're thinking, we've thought through models such as critical fabulation in relation to the traces in the archives, but the gaps and the silences. And so I think this is a question basically saying that relates to literary criticism and the writing of history and likely other modes of interpretation, because that's what you said. I mean, in my notes is bring care to interpretation, even to unsympathetic characters. And I'd like you to perhaps speak more about this, because I know you do write about it also in terms of a pedagogy of radical listening. I mean, that's something I'll keep coming back to again and again, but in your comments today, you mentioned, the how do we read for unspoken motivations, etc. So maybe but we could all talk about that a little bit from different disciplinary perspectives.
I very much love that. I think you mentioned archival silence. I've been examining critically, like, why is there a gap? Why is there silence? Perhaps does it mean that in my field, global Shakespeare adaptations, does it mean that there are no adaptations, no performances in Morocco? Or perhaps it is a function of white Western academia's limitations in terms of linguistic capacity. Bernadette, you've done so much work on globalization and across different languages as well. So you must be very familiar with this issue, right? Whenever there's archival silence, it could be a function of actually blind spot within a certain academia versus actual dearth of material on the ground.
And also the question of genres, like not assuming, which often happens, that sort of the genres formed through, I mean, Aristotle gets claimed by the West, but for what I do is very much also part of an Islamic philosophical and even literary tradition, but there are other traditions. So I think you're right. And we're still with literary criticism in a way, or literary history, but languages, assuming genres are transhistorical or transcultural, etc.
Yeah, and not only that, radical listening, but also citation practices. So the archival silence or kind of gap in scholarly knowledge also has to do with what or whom is being cited. And we talk about citation justice now. So my work is not out yet, but I'm writing about this. Epistemic injustice, citation justice. not just citing more marginalized work, making the unknown wrong, citing scholars of color. Of course, all that is very important, but if you think metacritically about why do we cite, it's actually an act of care itself. It involves ethics of care for scientific accuracy and comprehensiveness, as well as not regurgitating what algorithmic ranking mechanisms would show us, right? The current trap in terms of going back to AI is that, before generative AI algorithms have always been with us, and they actually dictate what is being cited because they draw on keywords, but also frequency of citation. So it's a self-enforcing loop. You go to JSTOR, project mirrors are very much influenced by this, what would float to the top, would surface. And so with an ethics of care, we'll pay special attention to these scholarly practices, but also the influences of research tools available to us. So I want to mention that. The other is, in terms of citation, the evidence. Bernadette, you're probably familiar with what I'm going to say. I work in non-mainstream fields, and very often I'm asked to, provide citation, even if it is my insight. But no, you have to cite because it doesn't count. I wonder if it has to do with my offstage identity. I believe it has to do with my racial and gender identities. Problematic editorial practices by some gatekeepers would really push that. And Sarah Ahmed, a famous feminist, actually has a wonderful essay talking about this. You can never cite enough evidence. It's here in the chat. Feminist killjoy.
Right.
That's a problem, right? There's never enough evidence when the topic is not Aristotle. Aristotle doesn't need footnotes, but everything else, all the non-white subjects, footnote, even if it's distracting, potentially. Right, or insulting, because, you mentioned deaf community, cite that, but there's a whole field, disability studies already out there. This idea of I couldn't be bothered to educate myself.
But I was just thinking about, and it was in your presentation, but the work you're doing in terms of the trans lens, and your argument that all Shakespeare, all literature is trans. So let's look at it through a trans lens, and that becomes the means to challenge us, cis sexism and all the intersecting sort of hierarchies of knowledge and of oppressive knowledge. So I was just thinking regarding Aristotle, they're not citing the huge body of literature on Aristotle, say, in the Islamic world, which is it's like as if Aristotle emerged in the Renaissance, when it became familiar to Renaissance thinkers because of the transfer of Greek knowledge, but which had been elaborated for almost 1,000 years in Arabic and Persian. And so it's really interesting that even in that, because I do think it's like a authorizing, gatekeeping, disciplinary practice that absolutely relates to, positionality, race, gender, and so on, sexuality. And but yeah, we shouldn't even assume Aristotle doesn't. There's a whole other way to read Aristotle even.
I want to circle back to critical fabulation, which you mentioned in your first question, which is related to archival silence. Let me first define archival silence. Basically, all archives have a silencing effect. Our sense of history is skewed by the prejudices of archivists. Materials deemed unworthy or sensitive have regularly been purged and excluded from archives. Our knowledge of history is also affected by evolving politics of access and visibility. There are accidental archives as well of collective memory and oral histories. These are ephemeral. So what do we do about archival silence? Cultural historian Saidiya Hartman makes a strong case for redressing history's omissions and gaps in official archives. She does so through critical fabulation, namely the use of speculative narrative to tell a fuller story about the lives of enslaved people. In terms of historiography, these so-called impossible stories counter the archival silence. Critical fabulation can become teachable moments. The method of critical fabulation is not only applicable to historiography, but also to literary criticism, because narratives are full of gaps for interpretation. Related to critical fabulation and archival silence is epistemic injustice. There are uneven expectations of scholarly labor. Minority writers are often asked to cite more to support their arguments. Sarah Ahmed writes that these writers are tired of being ambassadors. They're tired of explaining things. I've been thinking a lot about the use of explanatory commas in the saturation of white-focused culture. Basically, explanatory comma, as comedian Har Kondabolu said on NPR, is when you pause to explain something before continuing. When explanatory comma serves only white audiences, it becomes problematic, such as explaining a cultural reference to racial minorities. Explanatory commas is rarely used for white subjects, such as Aristotle or Shakespeare. Now, does explanatory comma reify the marginalization of racialized subjects, or maybe there are some benefits to it? What am I implying? For example, if I don't use an explanatory comma for Snow White, but I do for the Monkey King. I do want to address radical listening. Radical listening refers to proactive communication strategies that listen for the roots of stories. It creates an equality between teller and listener that gives voice to the tale. So we can pay attention to unspoken motivations rather than superficial plot elements. And this is connected to radical hospitality, the practice of consciously putting effort into making as many people feel welcome as possible. Radical means to change the fundamental nature of welcome. All this can be part of the ethics of care that we have been talking about.
I just wanted to, I was the one who asked about the realpolitik, and the reason that I found that so fascinating is because today's the 15th of March, so it's all Beware the Ides of March and everything. So there's like a lot of stuff around Julius Caesar. And I remember seeing a production of it in a sort of in the African politics. And I was just so blown by this idea that, you know, adaptations have to have like a political lens to it. And I found also this idea of like the academic and Shakespeare being a teaching moment really interesting, because I'll post it in the chat, but I remember coming across I'll post in the chat, but Stanford does this like joint reading that they do, and they staged a production of Julius Caesar, like all the first years, and they made this whole process, this idea of Shakespeare using Shakespeare and they did like racially blind casting, and they made a whole point around like, you know, the Brutus being played by a woman, and it just sort of spoke to all the things that you were saying. And I just thought it was really interesting that it's really happening at I don't know what point I'm trying to make, but I just want to say that like the readings, your work really just made me think a lot more about this stuff. Like I always just had a given like, oh, it's great that, you know, the casting the different races. Oh, it's great that this is how they do it, and this is so like empowering. And then it's like, oh, actually there's more layers to it. So thank you.
Compulsory realpolitik refers to the conviction that the best way to understand non-white subjects is by interpreting their engagement with pragmatic politics. This approach may imply that works from the global south are of interest only because of their testimonial value. And they were asked, what are the implications when we use Shakespeare's to do social justice work? Do works have to have political meanings? This is not a new phenomenon. Shakespeare's canonical status lends itself to social justice causes. Historically, the Western canon has been given mythical moral authority to some degree. 19th century writer Matthew Arnold famously declared that Shakespeare represented, quote, the best that has been known and said in the world, and thus the human spirit. Adaptations do often have political significance. They carry with them strong ethical implications. We listen to and let ourselves be subjected to the demands of cultural others. There are tensions between contemporary and early modern ethics. Gertrude's decision to marry Hamlet's uncle after the death of old Hamlet has typically been interpreted from a Western perspective as unethical. But Laura Buchanan's anthropological account of the reception of Hamlet among the Tiv people of Nigeria points out the flaw in the presumed universal validity of moral codes. There is also the perceived ethical burden to explain King Lear's problem away or to legitimize the character's suffering. Perhaps it's time now to focus more on his daughter, Cordelia. In any case, I would like to note that while artists and critics gravitate towards inspirational narratives, there is the risk of selling out on art's potential impact in terms of social justice. Advertising trends sometimes give false impressions of a work's inclusiveness. Marketing shortcuts can contradict artists' ethical claims in relation to the presentation of racial and gender diversity. Of course, all our work is inherently political, no matter what we claim, and I believe all artworks are. But compulsory realpolitik can be a real problem when it's deployed wrongly. When you mention Julius Caesar, the other prominent example, of course, is The Tempest. It is always post-colonial, isn't it? I think I wrote about this in the chapter on what makes global Shakespeare exercise in ethics. How in South Africa it is apolitical in a new way, and they deliberately wanted to move away in the 21st century, post-apartheid Cape Town, for instance, to regurgitate the Western view of post-coloniality is not very political. It's no longer political at all. Yes, political interventions are needed, but I think they did not want, the examples I cited, they didn't want to reconnect. They didn't want to recycle the tired metaphor. So they wanted The Tempest to kind of restore it to the comedic root, as well as carrying on political work that is actually meaningful for the location. So when we talk about politics or political interpretations, very often there could be cisgender, sexist, and white bias in there. So that's another place where we might have to be careful. I put up this slide to kind of give us a quick overview by compulsory realpolitik. I meant that there's this tendency in white scholarship to regard non-white adaptations as always political. And so works from China, for instance, is imagined to be always talking back to always connecting to, say, Cultural Revolution. Adaptation of The Tempest coming out of South Korea must be an allegory of the divided Korea. You know, there are two Koreas and so on. And so non-white directors and authors are compelled to give their work ethnic meanings, kind of rooted. What can you tell me about, for example, Morocco through this film adaptation? And meanwhile, white Western examples that assume to have more explanatory power, more universal meanings. You can see this in the London Globe's project of touring a Hamlet with a cast of 12 throughout the world, and in how they document the warm reception throughout the world and overlooked actually the resistance, the different meanings that derived. So it's kind of entirely from an English-speaking point of view. So material from the global South end up being recruited as footnotes to white theory. So I've expended a lot of effort in deconstructing this notion of compulsory realpolitik. I think this is actually applicable to to English language productions that are somehow seen as non-mainstream. It could be multiracial casting. It could be a gender diverse interpretation. It could be community projects, right? Anything but polished RSC or by the Shakespeare Theatre Company here in Washington, D.C., that sort of things, they will suffer from this expectation of compulsory realpolitik as well. So your example of Julius Caesar is very spot on. It's perfect.
Yeah, there've been not that they're just to add a footnote, well, so to speak, but even on my campus, there have been productions of Julius Caesar in relationship to Trump's,
Yes.
last presidency and his continued.
Yes. One other prominent example was New York Public Theater's staging of Julius Caesar, visually referencing Trump. That's not the first or the last, because Tony Blair, even Obama, a whole series of Western politicians have been slotted in for the role here for critique. And yet American Airlines and Bank of America, among other major corporate sponsors, decided to pull the support in the midst of the so-called controversy. A lot of the critics, they didn't even go see the production.
Wait, I just had a follow-up to that, because you mentioned this idea that the RSC and the NBC and this idea that they're sort of the standard polished. But I found it really interesting when I saw at the RSC last summer a production of Midsummer Night's Dream that sort of had disabled actors and trans actors, and now there's this whole controversy around oh my gosh, King Lear. Is it King Lear being played by a non-disabled actor? And there's like loads of controversy like in the news in the last month around that at the RSC, because it's the artistic director of the RSC has cast herself as King Lear. And so now there's all this talk about how it should be played by a disabled actor. And I just thought this like nexus of disability, race, gender, like I feel like it all feels so like present at the moment.
I think it behooves us to look closely at what they claim to be doing versus what they actually do. Almost all companies now, they want to score gains in social justice quotient. And so they will talk about queerness, for instance, when they don't actually do it on stage. Let me put in the chat here. Versus transgender Shakespeare Company, founded in London, 2016, went bust 2-3 years later. They're no longer there. RSC, of course, can come in and employ one trans actor here or there. So it's kind of the power relation bears being reiterated. You can't entirely overlook that, versus small companies like this that dedicated, are founded and led by trans identified artists, and yet they could not survive in this territory because of funding issues. So it's quite cruel and quite sad. And I'm always wary of bigger companies with resources. If they only pay lip service to inclusivity, I think it's highly problematic. And you'll be hard pressed to find any company who don't come out and say these things, right? And it's along the line of making it relevant, speaking to the society, to the current society, growing their audience, their fan base, of course. I'm very wary of diversity, DEI discourses that are tied into the corporate talk. In fact, it's a huge problem in corporations. When I talk about it, they actually tie into profit margins and how this is a good business case. Nothing inherently wrong in that, but I think overemphasis of that, particularly in the US, can be highly problematic, as if now DEI is just another means, just a means to an end.
It was a wonderful presentation, Professor Joubin. I've really followed your work for a long time because of my interest in adaptation studies. I was just thinking about how your current research on trans perspectives would get complicated by this, this sort of coming up of regional, local ideas of, how queer or trans cultures have thrived in different contexts. because I'm particularly thinking of India, where a lot, because of colonial imposition, a lot of those ideas probably would bring up a lot of complicated histories. And I'm just wondering how all of that would relate to adaptations today, which are trying to engage with these ideas in different contexts. Whether are they following a very Western framework, or are they trying to sort of excavate their own histories of how they engaged with these ideas historically? How is that exchange happening?
I wanted to mention that on the one hand, we should be mindful of the vocabulary we use. On the other hand, we also recognize the very real lived experiences of individuals who do not use our contemporary vocabulary of transness, queerness. Their life is not any less authentic. Individuals in different cultures and historical periods become invisible in our times due to our compulsion to only look for what we think we already know. So in other words, trans studies in global contexts, it is a conundrum because, of course, it's, at least at this stage, I am building on and using primarily white and Western frameworks. There's Snorton's work, it's wonderful, Black scholars work in trans studies, but yes, it is still Anglophone. And in different contexts, East Asia and in India, in Africa, there are more local theories, and yet at this point, they haven't been applied to case studies beyond those regions. So I see that as kind of one conundrum, something that we have to work on collectively in the future, but also terminology. I spend a lot of time thinking about terminology. We no longer speak of, in English, at least, male to female, female to male, this kind of identities, because as Jack Halberstam wittily wrote, it's as absurd as calling someone a heterosexual to homosexual man. It's a state of being rather than kind of you always have to mark the journey and in trans community activists, there are some who even resist the label. Why do you have to label someone trans woman rather than just women? If you follow the same logic, then you're starting to label fat women, short-legged women. Can you imagine all these kind of adjectives? But how come trans is, or even the idea of saying, again, in the English-speaking world, an openly trans actor. You don't say an openly cisgender actor. So parity. Let me share my screen. This is a forthcoming piece of mine in Routledge Handbook of Trans Literature, and you mentioned coming out. I am trying also to evolve my vocabulary to be more inclusive. Very often people talk about coming out, but now there's a trend to talk about inviting someone into one's personal space. It's a preferable way to describe the act of sharing one's practices with others, one's identification. Janet Mock, for example, you can look up her memoir. It's highly recommended. They talk about inviting people selectively into their personal space as a form of self-empowerment and assertion of autonomy, rather than coming out as if you have something to hide and you have to come clean. Instead, inviting someone in is actually very common across mainstream and minority communities. You don't just bring anyone into your home, do you? You bring friends, you want to have a good time. So it's the same concept. And of course, our relationship with people are variegated. Some we are closer to, some we are not. It's only natural. So they're trying to kind of normalize this rather than further trans queer stigma. And I very much respect this. When I read this, I felt very inspired, and it's a new way to talk about these things.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I love your work and have loved it for years. So I wanted to ask you a pedagogy question. So I'm just going to be selfish for just one moment. You brought up Twelfth Night, And I have this large Shakespeare course that myself and Julia, that we all kind of alternate teaching at UCI. We have 100, usually around 100 undergraduates, and I have 2 TAs. So it's a huge course. So students love it. It's kind of like a humanities course. So Twelfth Night is our sort of centerpiece. The students do a wonderful multimodal project. They do a production notebook of their own production of it. But so what happens is we usually do like a watch party and watch an adaptation together, actually on Zoom. It's something I started during the pandemic. And I did not choose this adaptation, but one of the TAs, I hadn't even seen it. The TAs said, let's watch She's the Man. I don't know if you've seen that one.
Yes.
I just do not like that one. So many reasons. I just want to know your opinion. It's so popular with the students. My TAs always say to teach it, and the students say, I love it. I find it so problematic. I don't like anything about it. And I've been wanting to change, but I don't know. What would you do? Would you keep it because it's so popular? And then I don't know what kind of conversation, or would you say, no, I don't know. What would you do?
Yes, She's the Man can be problematic. Sebastian effortlessly transforms into Viola in a frilly dress and vice versa. It would seem to be trivializing trans life. In the gender reveal scene, the Rossino figure named Duke has a moment of gay panic and falls in love with Viola, essentially a new person, rather than with the Cesario figure with whom he has spent most of the time on screen, and in whom he has confided multiple secrets. In the end, Duke and Viola share a kiss and dance at Viola's debutante ball. So yes, I see where you're coming from. This type of interpretation may reflect a cultural tendency to seek false clarity rather than to embrace uncertainty and regress into some kind of simplified binary worldviews regarding both gender and sexuality. But my theory of trans lens finds pedagogically useful aspects of She's the Man. The gender transformation scenes actually showcase the physical and emotional labor of curating one's self-presentation and public image. The act of curation is empowering for minorities, while She's the Man can be interpreted as biologically essentialist. It does center the transmasculine body with such gender prostheses as wigs and mustaches. The training montage shows how the character's gender practices evolve over time. Binary gender accessories do have their place in trans life and should not be unilaterally dismissed under the assumption that trans individuals alone have the burden to deconstruct the binary or power differentials. She's the Man affirms Viola's need for legibility. It illustrates that seemingly contradictory notions can be true at the same time in trans representation. Viola could be fluid or non-binary, perhaps not binary trans, but just fluid. And why is that not allowable? We should perhaps embrace and celebrate that. There are many ways to not to rescue, but I think it's still quite teachable, and I would never banish it from my syllabus just because it's so popular that I need to teach it. It's the opposite, because of its power and influence. It is still out there, even if I try to avoid it. I find it clever in deconstructing and parodying both masculinity and femininity. So it's actually doing both and imitating masculine gait and voice. For example, Viola Cesario ends up deconstructing the high school football-centric white masculinity. Even the final scene, this is the debutante ball, where walking with Duke, is she, we had this debate, is she giving in to prescribed gender roles or still being performative at this moment? And I brought in Susan Bordeaux to teach this, basically body studies, especially Bordeaux's unbearable weight. to say that the body is the text for cultural inscription. And that's what this film is about. Interestingly, 5 years ago, when I taught this, I had a lot of resistance from my students. You know, students who come to Washington, D.C., they know exactly what to say in social context, even if they don't believe in it. So they all thoroughly trashed and criticized the film for being transphobic and so on. But interestingly now, students taught me some new lessons in fluidity and non-binary. They said this Viola's presentation resonates with them because some of them engage in these practices, you know, changing back and forth. So what? And for them, that is fluidity at its best, and it needs to be recognized. And the film also does a great job in highlighting the theme of how gender is mistakenly intertwined with sexuality, and feminine men are coded as gay. All of these discourses, so it become kind of a rich text to open up these debates and discussions, right? And if you think about what kind of male bodies are being paraded in there, well, it looks like this, right? And there's a lot of fat shaming. They are able-bodied, you know, with abs, very chilled, they have confident gait. And that provided us with a lot of rich material for discussion. In any case, this is my answer. Sorry if it's a long-winded. I would not cut it because we need to address it because it's too popular. I also taught Barbie just because it's a cultural phenomenon and discourses are needed. I would not banish this, even if the works are flawed. To quote Bell Hooks, you know, Laura Mulvey has this famous feminist film theory of the male gaze. Bell Hooks has this theory of a positional gaze. So it's no longer allowed to do Bechdel tests to talk about male gaze, but actually we need to derive pleasure differently, not from male gaze or female gaze or even trans gaze, but a positional gaze. The pleasure comes from deconstructing all works, especially flawed works. So my job is not go out there and I found a perfect 12th Night. Nothing would ever be perfect. She's the man, of course. It is flawed, but flawed texts are excellent specimen in my intellectual lab.
That's thank you. I feel so good. I'm ready for the summer now. I only like the spider, right? Wasn't the spider mouth?
Hi, Alexa. It's always great to see you, and your talk today was amazing. I am definitely curious to hear more about how your theory of performativity has evolved in conversations with disability studies. So, like in your talk, you said that race, trans, and disability studies often come together and how they study atypical bodies. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, in what ways has attending to questions of body-mind diversity enriched or complicated your own understanding of the temporality of gender and racial identity?
One immediate benefit of attending to body-mind diversity temporally is that we realize atypical bodies are not fixed in time or place. Non-performance scholarship tends to regard gender practices as more fixed, which reflects the bias that printed text seems to be fixed. Performance dislodges these unexamined assumptions that text alone encompasses everything the words connote. Cameron Hunt McNabb has observed a similar phenomenon in the field of disability studies. The scholarly tendency to focus on the narrative text obscures the embodied significations of disability. The text-centric attitude treats disability as a metaphor, a trope, or some kind of narrative prosthesis. To expand disability studies vocabulary, McNabb proposes the concept of dramatic prosthesis for a holistic understanding of embodied and textual depictions of disability. So similarly, bringing performance studies methods to bear on trans studies is useful. We will turn gender variance from merely a plot device on the page into an essential and consequential part of embodied mimesis. The material aspects of performance can add nuance to the meanings of the physicality of gender practices. And these include actors and audiences' somatic presence, the voice, use of voice, props, costumes, and sets, and so on. So embodied experiences of disability and of gender move nonconformity and atypical body beyond such embarrassing themes as individual inadequacy, pity, and so on. We can maybe begin to see our collective vulnerability. The other part of your question concerns temporality. Let me say a few words about that. My translance deals with the question of temporality in two senses. First, the elucidation of gender practices as something that changes over time. And my theory also interrogates knowledge about the present and the past. Basically, gender and knowledge in time. So these two ideas are intertwined, both gender practices and the conceptualization of gender history evolve over time. Historical variations of a concept can denaturalize our own assumptions. In the other direction, our contemporary vocabulary can also denaturalize historical oppressions of minorities. And that brings me to this point. Performativity can affect tacit or explicit social actions. So there is tacit or more overt gender acts or transness, right? And everything evolves. There are many ways to think about the temporal aspect of race and gender, whether through this idea of kind of tacit versus overt, marked and unmarked, whether work mark itself as trans or as a racial work. We should come in and do the reading to liberate it from a sense of literal-mindedness, from cisgender sexism, from invisible whiteness, but also within the same work, we can attend to the fluctuation. A character can be toxic in one moment, but can be more sympathetic in the next. And so it all comes down to exactly which scene we're talking about. And I find that incredibly liberating. So we no longer have to decide whether to condemn Iago in the court of public opinion, right here and there and then, right? Or to assign blame. Let me stop sharing and go back to the radical listening that Bernadette brought up. Thank you, by the way. With that, which is a strategy of communication that promotes listening for the roots, hence the word radical. And talking about teaching, I find that one challenge is that my students always default to plot elements, which is highly problematic, or what is said. What we don't attend to is what is not said, but implied, but perhaps they don't feel comfortable saying, the characters, what goes beyond plot in a literal sense. The 12th Night example I gave, right? But what exactly happens in the final scene? It's open for interpretation. There are many possibilities. So with the radical listening, we can begin to pay attention to those moments as well. They are extremely rich. Even in King Lear's fairy tale division of the kingdom, why would Lear do this? Why would Regan and Goneril they seem to, even if it's a surprise, they seem well prepared. So you can begin to delve deep into the depths, and for me, that's literary criticism at its best at a basic level. But of course, there are political implications too, in terms of becoming fluid along with the characters, in many senses.
Abigail, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Do we have time for more questions?
Yeah. Yes.
So something you just said to Ella in your response made me sort of think about what I've been trying to sort of think through with what we read this week. I'm a historian, so that might give some context. And so your sort of discussion of stage beauty and the sort of final scene of like, do we have any sort of right to know or like to apply labels in this way? And I was wondering what if you have any thoughts or what you think about how we might apply some of these ideas in the historical context, because I know it's something I struggle with even when I'm like not labeling gender or race or anything like that, where it's like someone's accused of being a witch. Do we call her a witch or do we call her something else? Because the like access we get to them is so limited in the archives. And so I was just sort of wondering what you thought about that. I was talking to it with a friend today, and he was like, he used the phrase violence of labels. That like is just something that's like going around in my head right now as I'm like trying to think through all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Abigail. Violence of labels, very well said. This is relevant not only to historians, but to all humanities scholars. I'm very cognizant of being in someone else's space, right? Director space, someone else's cultural space. And here we do time travel. It's not our era. We are kind of intervening, but also entering, but potentially disrupting these historical spaces. So beyond being simply respectful, I believe it is empowering and appropriate to relabel these identities. Do we continue and call someone a historical figure a witch following the documents? Or do we do the corrections and make things more? It's not about making it palatable or erasing history, but rather to in the form of writing itself will become an act of care, like we talked about, right? Of course, we would thoroughly footnote it. At first instance, perhaps we'll quote the document. So that sense is preserved. It's not about kind of pretending history of slavery doesn't exist. But at the same time, I find it very important to approach it with an open-mindedness. When I started developing my trans studies project, one criticism that I received was so-called ahistoricism, because since trans is a modern label, right? Reviewers questioned whether I'm being ahistorical by trying to apply this to say a work like Twelfth Night, not just modern film adaptations. And in fact, even if early modernity did not use the exact label trans, their conceptualization of gender begs re-examination because of the different outlook and setup. For example, if you read Michel de Montaigne, those outrageous gender transformation stories, some of them inform Twelfth Night. What terms do we bring exactly to this? And even our vocabulary in trans studies, it's a particularly fast developing field. Writing during the pandemic, by the time my stuff was published at the end of pandemic, I received criticism for using outdated vocabulary. Can you imagine how fast it is? Frustrating, but at the same time very exhilarating. So I have to constantly trying to catch up. So that's even in our own era. So I would say something about historicity. Rather, it is necessary rather than ahistorical to excavate historical transgender figures by naming rather than glossing over the set of social practices. Granted, naming is a power act, it's a speech act, right? Maybe it's not perfect because of our own limitation of vocabulary, but I think drawing attention to vocab and terminology is itself a useful, so perhaps you can preface your work in the beginning in kind of talking briefly about these conundrums and to talk about, nonetheless, we still need certain words to describe, and so these are my choices for this moment. And fine, 5 years later, you publish new stuff. Of course, your thought may have well evolved like me, and vocab evolved. So I find it quite all right. That is another form of fluidity that we just have to live with. Contemporary and historical vocabularies can denaturalize each other. We can use modern anti-racist vocab to describe historical populations to avoid repeating the words from a past racist society, for example. A recent example is actually a new digital archive launched by the London Metropolitan Archives. And the project is called Switching the Lens, Rediscovering Londoners of African, Caribbean, Asian, and Indigenous Heritage, 1561 to 1840. This digital archive highlights the historical diversity of London's population. They did something that is unusual for many historians. Instead of words such as blackamoor, Turk, savage, one would have to search the digital archive using more neutral words such as Black, Asian, Indigenous person of color, and so on. The London Metropolitan Archives, they do this in order to create distance between a modern researcher and the violent, hostile language in history. This move addresses the violence of label that you brought up. The ways in which one is labeled by the society impacts how one's identities are made to perform. How we see dictates what we see. We can also think about minor archives as alternative space of knowledge. We can foster a culture of care and create socially reparative descriptions of historical figures and artifacts. We can model reparative practices when we demonstrate that cultural meanings are relational. The other part of your question seems to be anachronism. Is it okay to use such modern concepts as trans to analyze materials from a time before the term existed? First, there are trans-adjacent experiences that defy categorization. Historical trans lives remain valid despite difference in vocabulary. Those experiences may have been visible to people at the time within their own vocabulary. They are only invisible now due to our compulsion to look for what we think we already know. Secondly, the assumption that trans life did not exist in pre-modern times participates in the purging of trans identities from the historical record and from our collective memory. As the Byzantine scholar Roland Betancourt argues, not using intersectional open-ended modes of inquiry to look at pre-modern history actually risks collapsing modern ideas of gender onto historical ones, which creates anachronistic conjectures. The fact that early moderns did not generally use the word race to describe differences does not preclude racialized thinking in the time. Conversely, the fact that we no longer have slave as a category of social identity does not mean people are not enslaved by socioeconomic conditions. So it's necessary, rather than ahistorical, to honor historical figures' experiences by paying attention to experiences that are adjacent to contemporary practices in our own times. The words may be different, but the authenticity of the experiences would remain. The real question is, do archives help us hear the voices of the other or make history conform to what we think we want to know? As we see the past through archives, we both make the other knowable and preserve its otherness, ideally. By attending to archival violence and violence against archives, we can work against what Emmanuel Levinas calls the imperialism of the same, basically an assertive move of acquisition that forces unfamiliar things to conform to singular ideologies. As scholars seize artifacts and deploy them in knowledge industries, they become interlocutors and in some cases, even colonizers of history. So we should ideally become collaborators with cultural historical forces so that we don't take hostage of history and so that we are not taken hostage by history.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly say one little thing though? Is that okay, Jamie? I just wanted to add like again an asterisk because I was thinking about your in your forthcoming article, The Great Globe Itself, where an introduction to Shakespeare and heterotopia, you also elaborate a methodology of thick description. And I think that might also be a way. I think an example would be, even as you were speaking about Macbeth, and the word witch gets attached to the weird sisters who, and you use the term, but what sort of thick description could we do for a historian in archival sources, also accounting for, the conditions of production that have involved power differentials. So accounting for how is the person subject to persecution? They don't have a space to define themselves, but is there other ways? Are there other documents? And I think that's a thick description approach to add to what Alexa was recommending, is, like, to not reinforce demonizing or discriminatory language.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. Yes, a very thick description is not the answer to everything, but it is one solution in certain context. The term thick description was coined by philosopher Gilbert Ryle and then later popularized by Clifford Geertz. Thick description basically refers to a kind of qualitative research method that pays attention to layers of context. Gilbert Ryle calls superficial observations of behaviors thin descriptions, and he contrasted with the more productive contextual thick description of motivations for behaviors, as well as the reception of these behaviors. Thick description helps us combat several problematic tendencies in scholarship, especially national profiling. Basically, national profiling gives us linear narratives based on stereotypes of an artwork's nation of origin. Thick descriptions can also reveal deep connections among works or ideas that may otherwise seem siloed. As such, they decolonize assumptions about history and serve as a corrective to what I call compulsory realpolitik.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask this question. I don't want to embarrass you, but I do want to ask it, or at least I'd feel chagrined if I didn't. I think you're one of the 4 or 5 best writers in early modern studies right now. You've obviously won like all the awards and are prolific in a way that exhausts me just to think about. But the thing that really grabbed me reading a bunch of your work is you write some of the best topic sentences I've ever seen in published articles. Like, you could just take the topic sentences and like turn them into an outline in a way that like we teach in sort of grad seminars. I want you to talk with us just a little bit about, how do you do it? Like, what's the craft? What's the process? Especially the editing, like the level of clarity you have, given the complexity of the theoretical language, is really intimidating, but also like inspiring. And I'd like to know a little bit about sort of tips and tricks you have.
First and foremost, what works for me may not work for everyone, and English is not my first language. I'm very self-conscious of clarity issues. I always assume I don't write well until it's heavily edited. You are right about topic sentences. I develop articles or books out of a few core ideas. They may or may not work. Maybe they're full of holes, but I'll slowly build them out. Like I compare writing processes to painting. Like you paint over 100 layers, eventually you have Mona Lisa. It's a very messy process. I also am part of a writing group, which I started during the pandemic, so that helps. I write in small chunks, so a lot of bits and pieces. I have a huge warehouse full of proverbial post-it notes. Many small things, It could be a note that I type in as I was on my way to the metro. I suddenly have this idea. Maybe it would not come to fruition, like baking. You would not set. Maybe it will. Maybe not for this one, but someday. So that's how I work, kind of fragmented. You can really start your physical post-it note or proverbial post-it note. Think of a topic, that you're passionate about, and start jotting up all these ideas. They may or may not be thoroughly connected. In terms of writing for audiences, I will always think of my my average student in my undergraduate class, if I were to say this rubbish in class, what do I get? They kind of fall asleep there, or do I get across to them? And that's often very helpful. I happen to prefer shorter sentences. There are plenty of the far more prominent scholars than me. I think Judith Butler is dense for a reason. I want you to slow down. I prefer shorter sentences with simple transition. You should see my pile of rejections for publication and grant applications. The stuff that is out and the success story is the tip of the iceberg. So I would say it's a ratio of 7-3. It's very important to put out there.
Yeah.
Because yes, it's our job. If we were saying as made it, I want to share this kind of story so that people don't feel frustrated. You are not alone, and it's not you. So but I write every day, and I have a huge stockpile and kind of conveyor belt going on. So 7 rejections, but I'll have 3 success stories. Remember, so the quantity also helps, and they build on each other. So when I finish one, kind of new ideas, they're budding. That's the next one. So they are not all out of the blue. So from afar, it may look like crazy. How can she do this? Actually, they are interlinked. They're all interlinked. Now, the race and gender thing, in the beginning, I wrote about global adaptation. Of course, I'm concerned with bodies on stage and somatic presence. I didn't explicitly write about it, but it's only natural. Eventually, I'll touch on the topic of race, gender, sexuality, and disability because it's an embodiment question. So that's kind of building on my root as performance studies scholar, and it's not exactly out of nowhere. The trends, sometimes it's I'm grateful to senior scholars who take me under their wings or push me. Evelyn Gojowski, who is very interested somehow in this potential for trans theory being applied to Shakespeare studies. She's the one who pushed me after I wrote the book Race. She said, "You can write race. Can you do gender?" So look for yourself some kind of ladders and stepping stools, and don't be frustrated by failures. I'm currently writing about this. This is slightly metacritical, a bit autobiographical, in a book about failure and academia. How the system could fail certain people, but also how we perceive and frame failure. We don't talk enough about it. My research is often not recognized by traditional disciplines. I often combat systemic erasure of me as a person and of the interdisciplinary work that I do, which has led to my imposter syndrome. These are symptoms of systemic failures in academia. I found solace through writing, and I'm compelled to write with clarity. In fact, I never quite feel at home in any single department. I have received a number of labels and have called myself a few at different points in time. Depending on the context, I have been seen as a Shakespearean who works across time and cultures, as someone who is expected to represent minority communities in some form, and as a digital humanities scholar who brings critical race and gender studies to bear on each other. As a minority scholar writing about non-mainstream topics, I'm frequently expected to explain myself. This has contributed to the clarity of my writing. Questions of racial and gendered otherness loom large in my academic and personal life. As an immigrant and as a woman of color, I've been looking for refuge from politics that cause personal harm. However, I had shown these issues as research questions for a long time, even though, or maybe because, they are too close to home. It is fair to say that I've always been on the road. This sense of marginalization has shaped and energized the kind of work I do. My positionality has made me more self-conscious about the purpose of my writing.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. we're going to be looking for that. I mean, thank you. That's a great question, Jamie. We've kept Professor Joubin a lot longer than we initially planned. So thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. I mean, we have so many more questions, so the dialogue will continue. And yes, we're looking for that book on broadly speaking, and to think that through. So thank you. Their hearts, everyone's clapping. We really appreciate reading deeply into your work, and we'll read more deeply and responding to questions. So